Hey everybody, this is Jen Kleinhens.
And I'm Rob Vose.
And you're listening to another episode of Everybody Hates Your Brand, a podcast where we talk about our thoughts and opinions on marketing, from customer experience to brand and everything in between. Join us today as we talk to Fiona Craig, marketing veteran and executive coach, about the barriers to great thinking in marketing and how we might remove them.
So today's interview is somewhat of a break from the norm. This is very much a podcast about marketing. Hence the name. And indeed, our guest today is a marketing veteran, having worked at various agencies and clients, most recently as strategy director at Armadillo. And if you remember, we had James Ray, CEO of Armadillo, on a few weeks ago. But interestingly, I guess, is taking that experience and is turning it into a new direction as an executive coach, helping teams to remove barriers to deliver best thinking and performance. And I think that's something that's really fascinating in the world we're currently in COVID land and post-COVID land. So we would like to very much to welcome to the podcast Fiona Craig. Fiona, welcome to Everybody Hates Your Brand.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So what we do at the beginning of these, I'm sure you've are aware, is we have what we call a credibility section, which is where we ask the guests to kind of give a bit of background to themselves and what they're currently up to. So would you mind giving us a little bit of a sort of career history, a career biography, please?
Sure. I'm very happy to do that. And I love the fact you call me a marketing veteran because it's true, actually. I have spent 20, I'm not even going to finish that sentence, in marketing. I've worked client side and agency side. I worked for big networked agencies like Havas, and I've worked for smaller SMEs like Armadillo. And then client side, I've worked for AXA, huge, big organizations. So I've got a really broad history within the marketing context. But when I look back now at the red thread that's been running through my career, and the thing that's influenced me moving into coaching now is the notion of behavior and thinking and the influence that those two things have on each other. And I think originally in marketing, it's about influencing the way that customers think, the way they think about brands, the way they interact and behave with those brands, and how communications can influence and impact that. Then moving into senior leadership roles within organizations, I think my focus really shifted to how thinking influenced decision making and leadership. And then that's taken me into executive coaching, which is the impact that the way we think has on pretty much everything we do around us. And, I can't really think of an industry that's more heavily rooted in the principles around the knowledge economy than marketing, which is all about the power of our brains and how we invent stuff that doesn't exist. That's what we do. We think about what could be. And so really thinking about how we think is a thread that's been running through my entire career in one way or another. But it's just shifted its focus from starting with consumers, brands, then agency leaders, and teams and leadership teams. And now to individuals still very much within the creative industry that I'm working with, some advertising and marketing leaders facing very similar challenges. But again, it's all about the power of thinking. And in fact, yesterday I was reading an article that came across a great term. When you see something written down and you think, oh yeah, that's me. And the term was metacognition, which is the act of thinking about thinking. And I thought, that's what I do. That's what I do, thinking about thinking, because I don't think we do enough of it. I think there's so much focus on doing, when no doubt we'll come and talk about this. There's so much focus on doing that I think sometimes thinking gets forgotten about. And that's what I would like to address, really.
Well, it's almost as though we rehearsed that, because it's an interesting segue. When we were sort of talking before the podcast, we were talking about questions and that kind of stuff. We talked about what the barriers are, or what are some of the barriers you think that prevent best thinking and as therefore as a knock-on effect performance within teams. So you've talked about doing overthinking being one of those things. What are the kind of those barriers that you think are most destructive from that perspective in terms of preventing teams achieving their potential?
Sure. I think there's a few things, and I guess you could group them all loosely together by saying it's the act of assuming that good thinking happens automatically. So there's a number of things I think that can go wrong. I mean, I know we'll probably come on to talk about this. Most of them can be addressed and resolved, so it's not the end of the world. But I think if you're not careful, these things can creep in and trip up good thinking in your agency, in your teams. I think the most fundamental one is around psychological safety. Is this group that I'm in safe for interpersonal risk taking? So do I have a real sense of confidence that I'm not going to be embarrassed or rejected or punished in some way for what I'm about to say? And, obviously at one end of the spectrum, that could be saying something so controversial that I am kicked out of my job, I might lose my job over it. But actually, more realistically, it's going to be things like, am I laughed at? Am I ignored? Am I left out of the next meeting? Is there that kind of tumbleweed moment where people roll their eyes? I've been in situations with creatives within an agency as a planner where we've been kind of kicking off the creative brief and warming up that creative brief. And I've been kind of put back in my box very much by a creative director who would say, you're the planner, it's not your job to get creative. And that, even as a sort of fairly senior person in the mix, that makes you clam up. That makes you go, well, maybe I'm not going to say the next thing that I would otherwise have said. Maybe I'm not going to share my thoughts. And I'm guessing we've all been in that situation. I mean, what do you guys think?
That sounds remarkably familiar to me, and a couple of examples I can think of for that. Yeah. Jen?
Yeah. I'm just too bullheaded, though. I'll just keep doing it. It just makes me angry.
It's interesting. There are different responses to it, isn't it? It means you kind of, if you're feeling angry, there's a kind of shutter that comes down on your thinking, perhaps, that sort of channels you in a certain direction and stops just that sort of broad open thinking. And then for people who aren't feeling, aren't quite as confident, then it can mean they just clam up. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of the thinking goes down, although it certainly can do. It can send you into a bit of a sort of triggered spiral of, oh God, I'm not good enough. But it certainly means you're not likely to share your thoughts with the rest of the group. So that has a real impact on collaboration and bouncing those ideas around and just using sharing ideas, because the more you share, the more the good ones are going to come out. And even if this idea isn't that good, it might spark something from somebody else. Somebody else may be triggered into having a good idea off the back of it.
Is there a part of that kind of plays into sort of there's a territorial aspect to that. There's a kind of not invented here. Even if it's a fabulous idea, if somebody in the creative team or strategy team or whoever it is didn't come up with it, we're not interested because we didn't come up with it, and actually we're protecting our part of the process because that's what gives us value and worth in the process.
I think that's a really interesting one, because one of the other things that I was going to talk about in terms of a kind of a blocker to really good thinking is, I was thinking of it in terms of hierarchy and the notion that there's senior people and junior people, and only people at a certain level have permission to take certain actions or make certain decisions. But I guess it would also work sideways across silos, which is that's not your job, that's my job. And you can think of the notion of T-shaped people, which is where I have a specialism, I have a deep specialism that goes this way. I'm not sure whether hand signals work well.
Just creating a vertical line with the hands, listeners.
But I've also got understanding of the and now there's a T-shaped bit across the top where your knowledge kind of spans out to meet the skills and knowledge of the areas adjacent to yours, so that you can work really effectively with them. But if that territorial notion that you're talking about does kick in, then yes, it's gonna really limit you down, and it just means you will limit, you'll kind of self-censor, because you'll go, oh, I don't know if it's okay to say this. I don't know if I'm stepping on someone's toes. I don't know if I'm going to get some pushback from straying into someone else's areas.
Now, it's interesting too when you start to think about this idea of like lateral thinking, and how sometimes, someone who is very trained to think in a certain way, so creative might be, maybe not creative, but maybe like a planner or a manager or something might be thinking sort of the A to B to C, and they get the little bit of the tunnel vision because they've thought in that way for so long, and they're looking at a certain set of data. And in a way, that's really good, right? But I think you also kind of miss the outside influences from someone who like myself is just, well, what about that thing? You know what I mean? Just like a bunch of random stuff that kind of cross pollinates. And it's interesting because if you think about sort of these mindsets that people have around things like grit or like a fix versus a, more of a growth mindset, like where do good ideas come from? Is it quantity? Is it, one little polished gem that should come straight out of the creative department and no place else? So it's interesting when you talk about that, because a lot of times, in those meetings, it feels like a lot of sort of biases and sort of, subconscious sort of ingrained thoughts about thinking and where good thinking comes from and how good thinking happens can sort of bubble to the surface.
I totally agree. I think there's loads of things going at work and loads of assumptions that we make about other people, which is, at its most coarse, I suppose, it's, people like you don't have those kinds of ideas, whatever people like you might mean. Someone in your team, someone at your level, whatever, someone who's really new, or then that builds in the notion of cognitive diversity, somebody who doesn't think like me. And I mean, one of the other things that I think stops good thinking is, and it's part of psychological safety, because one of the ways to build psychological safety is the notion of equal talk time. So does everybody in the team or everybody in the meeting have the same amount of airtime? And are you building structures in place to make sure that that's protected? Because naturally, the extroverts are going to be straight in there and the introverts are going to hold back. So there's an imbalance there. The more senior people may well jump in. That's a big generalization, but it's realistic to assume that the more senior people are going to jump in and lead. More junior people may feel safer just agreeing with them. So where do those different voices come in? Where's that neurodiversity? I'm thinking about this differently. Here's a different perspective on them on that. Where does that come in if there's no psychological safety for people to say, well, actually, I'd like to make this suggestion, or do you know what, I don't really agree with you. Can we try that again? There must be some other way that we can do this. How could we do it differently? Mm-hmm. So I think there's generally a lot of biases built into the way that we think about other people, definitely.
One of the things you used a phrase when we were talking on email prior to the session that I loved was the phrase radical candour, which I think is fabulous. Would you mind kind of explaining that concept a little bit, please?
Candour. Yeah, I love this one too. So this comes from a book called Radical Candour by Kim Scott. And it's a way of, you can use it for feedback, but you can also use it for difficult conversations. You can also use it for, any kind of creative situation where you need to kind of thrash stuff around. But it's radical candour is built on two axes, one of which is what she calls, this is why I love it, she calls the give a damn axis. Do I give a damn about you, or do I not give a damn about you? And this is the idea of how much do I care about you? Now, ideally, I'm going to care about, so let's say it's somebody in my team, I do care about you very deeply. I care personally. I want you to be the best version of you that you can be. At the other end of the spectrum, it's like, actually, I don't really care about you very much at all. And then on the other axis, you've got the willingness to piss people off axis, which is another one I really like. So how prepared are you to say something that may be uncomfortable to hear? Or are you more concerned with you being comfortable, them being comfortable, and being nice? So this gives you a kind of four-part grid, which, we all love a four-part grid, don't we?
We do.
If you care deeply and you are willing to challenge directly, then that is where you create radical candour, which is, I care very much about you. I care about your progression, your well-being, but I'm going to challenge you very much because I know you can do better. I know you're capable of great things. I want you to do the very best you can. And therefore, I'm going to give you this difficult feedback, or I'm going to give you this difficult message because I know you can take it and I know you can do good things with it. So that's that quadrant, the radical candour quadrant. What mostly happens is I care very much about you, but I don't want to challenge you directly. I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want you to be uncomfortable. And so I'm just going to say the nice thing. And Kim Scott calls this ruinous empathy, because we fail to tell them something that they would be better off knowing. And this happens so much. This happens pretty much everywhere I've worked. There's been this difficulty in giving hard feedback. useful, real feedback. I've struggled to give it myself. It's a really hard, feedback, God, is just one of those really super hard things. So this is why this framework works really well for me, because if you had a choice of which square you'd be in, you would be in the radical candour one. And actually, I think that's how you would want people to treat you. If you're in the bottom two squares and you don't care personally about somebody, but you challenge them very sort of directly, but you don't care about them, that's when you get potentially into bullying territory. So you don't want to be in that square. And then the other square is when you don't care very much about them, but you equally don't want to give them any difficult messages, which is it's called, I think, manipulative insincerity. So this is when you get your kind of passive aggressive messages, a bit sort of backstabbing-y, really thoroughly unpleasant, and we don't want to be in that square either. But when you phrase it like that, the notion of radical candour, which is, can we have those really honest, difficult, but actually really energizing conversations with each other to say, look, I disagree with you, or I know you can do better, or we go, something's going wrong. Can we rethink about this? That honesty can open up some really good quality thinking.
As a heavy metal fan, Ruinous Empathy feels like it should be a band name. I don't know why it's not. Someone needs to put that on a t-shirt.
Doesn't it?
That's amazing. It's like a Norwegian black metal band. Ruinous Empathy. That is fabulous.
Well,
yeah, sorry, go on.
Supported by obnoxious aggression, perhaps.
I think one of the other ones we talked about, I think that's fascinating. And we'll come back to kind of how we can kind of alleviate some of these barriers in a minute. But the last one we kind of talked about, which I think a lot of people will recognize, is this idea of when decision-making gets escalated, and about that the further up the chain you go, the less you know, and unless you're aware of almost the impact of your decision in some way. So I remember a comic strip, it might have been Dilbert, I can't remember, it talked about as a particular presentation moved up the chain, it started as a detailed sort of engineering thing, and it said, it needs to go to a senior person, cut it down to 10 slides. It needs to go to another senior person, just cut it down to a slide. It needs to go to CEO, just make it one sentence. And by the time it gets to that point, you've moved so far away from what the actual issue is, they don't know what the decision they're making bears no resemblance where it started.
Yeah.
So that idea of the right decisions, people making the right decisions, I think you talk about as a barrier. So do you want to sort of, I guess, expand on that a touch?
Yeah, sure. So this comes from the work of Frederick Laloux and his book Reinventing Organizations, which is where principles of self-managing teams come from. But one of the elements within it is this notion of who makes the decisions, and devolved decision making. So you don't have a single point at the top or single group of people at the top that everything gets escalated up to them. They make the decisions, and then the answers get escalated all the way back down again. And there's a book called Turn the Ship Around, written by David Marquette, where he talks about pushing the authority to make decisions down to where the information is. Because if something needs to be addressed, then the people who identify that there's a problem that needs to be addressed or decision needs to be made are probably the ones that are going to have the most information about what a good solution would be. But those people tend not to have the authority to make those decisions. So it gets escalated up to the managers, or even further up to senior leadership team, who don't really have the time. They don't really have the information. So they'll kind of delay it. They'll put it off. They're not really sure. They'll tap back down and it'll get delayed. And then they'll sort of turn it into a really big decision, and it'll have to go around. And then the answer will get passed down, and you may not get the optimal answer. And it's really the notion of the people at the top don't have the right kind of information, and the people on the coalface don't have the right kind of authority. So can you bring those two things together and bring the decision-making power down to where the information is, so those decisions can be made faster and more imaginatively, because the answers are going to be generated by the people who can see the problem and who experience the problem. And that might be account managers using some bit of software, or needing to access some budget for some client requirement. Actually, they're the ones that can see what the problem is, and they can probably see what the solution is as well. But so often those decisions are taken out of their hands and made by somebody else, when they could just very well be made by them on the spot. And one of the ways that you can kind of contain this is by saying, well, what's the risk here? Is this decision going to move us forward in some way? Is it safe to try? Can we move forward? Is it going to be disastrous if this turns out to have been the wrong decision? And if it's not going to be disastrous, then just let them make it, because they're probably going to come up with the best solution.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of a quote that I've seen from Jeff Bezos, which is almost exactly like that. There's two types of decisions. There's a decision that you can walk back, and there's the decision you can't come back from. And he said most decisions are decisions you can walk back. So even if it's big and expensive, you can pretty much say like, we're done with that, whatever that product we came up with, that innovation, whatever it might be. So he's actually saying that, a lot of decisions are much lower risk than people would assume, right? Like in my career, I was working at AT&T, so big telecom in the States. And a part of my job was running something called the Innovation Pipeline, which was an internal sort of crowdsourcing platform that was intended to do that because, at the time we had 300,000 employees. So it was hard for, the guy up at the tippy top, the chairman, to understand like what was happening in a retail store on like a line that they were putting up. It's that kind of thing that, we always found it to be really useful, is you could kind of skip all the, the bullshit in the middle and then, go right to the top and the decision is made. I guess my pushback or my challenge on that though is how do you help people kind of understand the difference between a decision that could be made in a pocket by a specialist and a decision that does need to go to someone who has a more of a broad view of what's going on in different parts of the company? Because the silo issue, I think, is kind of what pops to my mind.
Sure, that's a great question. And I think there's various techniques that have been defined that you can use here. So, one of the big things at a general level is to make sure that everybody in the business is clear on the strategy and the direction of the business, because that's what you use to make your decisions against. So there's a reason why everybody down to the most junior person is really clear on where we're pointing, because they can use that to say, I think because we're pointing in that direction, therefore I think this is probably going to be the right solution. So that's your first thing, which is available to absolutely everybody. Then there are decision-making tools available. One is called the advice process, where you can say, well, I'm going to make this decision, but I have to ask the advice of everybody affected by this decision. I don't have to follow it, but I do have to ask for it, and I do have to take responsibility for the decision I've made if I decide not to follow their advice. So there's one method of doing it. I've summarized it very much. And there's another one, which is it's called the consent process. And it's around trying to work out this solution, this proposal may not be perfect. We're not going to know whether it's perfect or not until we try it. But is it safe to try? Is it going to move us forward in some way? Yes or no? And that's the criteria that you're going to say yes or no on, not is it perfect? Because it's, A, we don't know. And B, trying to get any size group of people to agree on something is, time consuming. Everyone's got an opinion, but it's about saying, is this proposal safe to try? Actually, no, it's not safe to try. Then you go back to the board and start again. But mostly, yeah, it's going to be safe to try, isn't it? Is it? And that's the same principle as you were talking about, Jen, which is actually, can we wind back from this if it goes wrong? Yes, we probably can. So I think there are a couple of things that can be brought into play there to help people further down the organization to make decisions, and also to help people further up the organization to let go of the need to make all the decisions.
What's interesting is when we've talked about these barriers, talked about psychological safety, we've talked about radical candour, we've talked about how decision making is escalated, and obviously a lot of those things are interesting to unpick and will be unique in some ways to the organization that you're dealing with. And obviously one of the best ways of fixing them is to hire a fabulous executive coach like Fiona. A lot of those feel like they are influenced from the culture from the top down. So I've worked in organizations where I don't want to micromanage, and I hope anybody who's worked for me would agree that I don't. But people above are being micromanaged, and then that travels down, and then that travels down. Then there is an expectation that you are on top of every little last thing that your team is doing. How much of these can be fixed ground up, I guess, or is the top down thing the dominant, or how that works from top down the dominant factor in removing some of these barriers?
Well, that's an interesting one, because I think they've probably all got elements that could go in either direction. So I think one of the things that we probably would all recognize is, particularly over the last year, is the quality or perhaps lack of quality of meetings. Anybody, and I think anybody who hosts a meeting or anyone who hosts a Zoom with more than 3 people on it has the ability to affect some of these things themselves in that environment that they've created for themselves. So I think it doesn't have to be top down. There's small things you can do in small group environments that can just start to build a little bit more psychological safety, can start being more honest and candid with each other, and can start experimenting with decision making. Decision making one probably does have more of an element of top down, but I suppose you can start from the bottom by saying that just the principle of, well, let's just ask for permission rather than forgiveness, and saying, sorry, other way around. Let's ask for forgiveness rather than permission. Let's say, look, I know the company's strategy. I know which direction we're going, and I'm going to show you that I've made my decision based on that strategy. And I've gained advice from various people. There's ways that you could do it, and take a chance and say, I'm going to do this. Is that okay? You can make that sort of small step without any kind of top-down involvement. So I think there's quite a lot of small things that can be done to build these better ways of thinking into our little everyday practices.
You mentioned the pandemic, which has had obviously an extraordinary impact on everybody's lives, personal, work, the whole 9 yards. Obviously, one of the things that I was reading an article, I think the other week in The Guardian, about how it has, in some ways, it's obviously helped a lot of people, especially, to use a classic extrovert, introvert, people who maybe aren't, don't talk in meetings or don't feel comfortable doing that, but actually feel they can be productive away from the office and create, and that kind of idea of neurodiversity and those kind of things. So it's helped some people, and obviously it's hindered others. What have you seen in terms of how it's amplified barriers or thrown up new ones? You mentioned Zoom meetings, and obviously everyone's been through those joyous you're on mute conversations. Mm-hmm. What has that done in terms of the pandemic and some of those issues that the psychological safety and all those kind of things that you've raised? Has it made them worse, better?
Oh, well, I think it's gone both ways. I mean, the most obvious one, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this. In terms of psychological safety, I think that the notion of Zoom meetings with cameras off and mics off, there's that screen of blank little icons is one of the things that just doesn't encourage participation, unless you already have a huge amount of it, and for some reason you've agreed that you're going cameras off. But there is culturally within some big organizations that even now don't follow the principles of introducing each other at the beginning of a meeting. So you're having a meeting with people and you don't even know who they are and why they're in the room, what they've got to contribute. And that can't generate a situation of collaboration and inclusion, and this is what we're here to do. So even a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to somebody, started a new job, had this situation of where they just had a cameras off culture and nobody introduced anybody as a new person. So that's easy to fix. Anybody can fix that in a meeting. It doesn't require leadership to do that. Anyone can say, look, can we just stick our cameras on and just say hello? I think probably by the end of the pandemic, everyone's got their Wi-Fi sorted out. So I don't really buy the whole dodgy Wi-Fi thing on the whole. So I think psychological safety has been compromised because it is difficult to rebuild those relationships. They're harder to build, but harder to maintain. But by the same token, I think the fact that we've had to shove everything online, there are some incredibly great collaborative tools that can be used to support equal talk time, to support collaborative working for introverts, extroverts, to take away the hierarchy. Mural, Miro, there's some fabulous tools out there that I think have actually probably improved. they've been there all along, but we've been forced to use them. Collaborative docs, Google Docs, shared docs, being able to comment on each other's work means that actually you don't necessarily have to have a meeting. So I think the pandemic has thrown up some solutions that were there all the time, but we didn't know that they'd work. But they do work. So it's kind of given and it's taken. I think probably the worst thing that, is all over the newspapers, especially in the last week when it's been Mental Health Week, is the issue of burnout and long hours and the lack of distinction between work and home life. And I think that has a massive detrimental effect on your capacity to do good thinking, to do good work, full stop. There's a fundamental mismatch between the way our brains work and our a lack of ability to multitask and the amount of time it takes us to refocus on another task between the way literally the neuroscience of our brains and the kind of the always on nature of emails coming through, Slack messages coming through, chat messages coming through, and the fact that we're sort of zooming around. I think somebody called it the hyperactive hive mind mentality, which just kind of gives you that kind of notion of the way that many people are working now. And I think that has got worse this year. So that I think is a real detrimental impact on the way the quality of people's thinking.
Yeah, it's an interesting one too. If you talk about the neuroscience of, jumping on email every time you get a notification or like a Teams, you get a little hit of serotonin every time you do it. You know what I mean? And actually, it's interesting because I was actually writing and reading about this the other day around this idea that, people get that hit of cortisol and it makes you anxious, it makes you upset, but you also kind of get addicted to it. So it's like the interplay between the stress hormone and the happiness hormone that makes people feel like, A, they're getting tons done because every time an email comes in, it's out of their inbox in 10 seconds. And, B, and then it feels like you're getting nothing done because you're just paying attention to email instead of doing the act. And I think planners especially, right? Like managers is a slightly different thing. I think client service is slightly different, like requirements of the job, like email is a part of, kind of what you're expected to do. But for people, to your point, who think for a living, it's incredibly disruptive to just have to turn around every 2 seconds and, switch from the thing that you've been focused on and sort of flowing with to, oh, I have to think about this other thing and I can't think about this. And now I've got to go back to this and get back in the zone. And I had 6 PowerPoints open and where was I? What did I do? Oh, wait, there's another email. I'm not getting anything done.
Do you find emails less distracting than somebody coming to my desk and throwing a brief in my face and saying, we need to get this out today? So there is, at least I can turn that off. I can't let people wondering.
You can turn it off. You're right, but do you? Culturally, is it okay for people to turn their emails off? One of the good things I have seen recently is the rise of certain initiatives to support this switching off. So, for example, my husband's company, they've just introduced Focus Fridays, where you're not allowed to have any Zoom calls on a Friday. You can have a one-to-one conversation with somebody, but no Zoom calls. I've come across organizations that have like a company lunch break where for an hour and a half, nobody can contact anyone else. Doesn't mean you can't work. You can do what you like in that hour and a half. You have your lunch, go for a walk, work away, but nobody can contact you. And that feels, it shouldn't be necessary, but, it feels like a creative solution to just, I could actually do some work in that hour and a half. It's the notion, it's the shift from busy work. And Jen, I totally take your point about client services. It's a different type, but, creatives, analysts, developers, planners, absolutely those ones that need to get their head into something. That deep work is where they need to be for a couple of hours at a time. And culturally, that just seems to be so difficult to achieve.
Nothing is worse than seeing my diary and seeing like a big, 3-hour gap where I was going to think about something and work on it. And then someone stuck a half an hour, just a cheeky little half an hour meeting right in the middle. And I'm like, no, that was my time. Because they've seen it's a hold or it's a thinking time or a working time. And they're like, that's not real work. So I'm just going to stick this meeting in here.
Absolutely. And it's that could you just, that killer, could you just have a look at this for me? Could you just make this change? Could you just rerun those figures? It feels like it only takes me 2 seconds to ask the question, but it takes you half an hour to do it. 15 minutes to get your head out of the previous thing, another 15 minutes to get your head back into the next thing. It's a killer. There's little interruptions. Yeah.
What's interesting is it seems that a lot of people who were, we're very fortunate that we may be able to work from home without much disruption. A lot of people who are, in a one bedroom in a flat in London were probably desperate to get out and get back to the office. But it seems to be the model that a lot of agencies and a lot of clients are moving to a hybrid model. So 2 days in the office, 3 days out, 3 days in the office, 2 days out, which to me is interesting because I think it presents some relatively unique challenges that we haven't necessarily, done before. And the idea of, okay, well, some people do you have everybody come in on the same days so that there's a purpose for those days and you set the purpose for those days so that everyone knows what they're doing? Because if you just let people come in any random day, well, then you're going to have some people in the office and some people at home. And how does that work technologically even, let alone anything else? You might as well all be at home if you're all going to be on a video screen. Mm. So what are the kind of things that you're worried about or intrigued about in terms of how that hybrid sort of model is going to play out?
Well, it is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, particularly within the creative sector, I think we are going to retain the ability to work remotely and work from home. It doesn't feel like everybody's going to be made to go back into the office 5 days a week anymore. I could be wrong about that, obviously, but that's where I sense we're going. And yeah, I was thinking about, do you remember the olden days, 2 years ago even, where 5 of you were in a meeting room and then one person was dialing in because they were on the train? And sometimes you'd forget to even dial them in. You'd either forget to dial them in the first place, or you'd forget they were there. And at the end, they wouldn't say anything.
Scare you.
Yeah, they'd scare you, absolutely, by going, oh yeah, thanks guys. You go, shit, I'd forgotten they're on the call. And, and it could be that we're heading back, are we going back to the same situation, as you say? Or are we just going to end up with, well, we're all in a room apart from a few people, but we might as well all be separate? But I think you touched upon it, which is around purpose, which is why do we need to be together? What tasks are better done face to face? And what tasks don't need to be done face to face? And in fact, what tasks don't need a meeting? I would love to ban the status meeting, actually. I would love to do it as just collaborative docs only. Even to say, 4:00 every day, we all go into the document, or, whatever your normal cadence might be. We're all in the document updating it at the same time, but it doesn't have to be a meeting. You could just take what you need from it, contribute what you need to it. I'm pretty sure we'll never get rid of the status meeting, but nevertheless, I think there are alternatives. I've seen some great technology with meeting rooms are set up with huge video screens and those little movable cameras, so that the camera swivels to follow whoever's speaking, which means the experience for people at home or remote is much more like being in the room. And the people in the room are kind of sitting in a semicircle facing this massive wall of screens. So there is some tech that makes that whole experience, that whole sort of lopsided experience, better. But I imagine that's a fairly hefty investment that not all, especially smaller businesses, can invest in. So I honestly don't know the answer. I think that the notion of how we run meetings is going to have to change to enable a kind of democratic experience for everybody, regardless of where you are. And I think that there's something called liberating structures. These are ways of holding dialogues, meetings, ideation sessions, and they sound like a contradiction because they are structures. So they're highly structured ways of holding a dialogue. But they're incredibly liberating in terms of the fact that they allow you to do great thinking. They make space for listening. They make sure that everybody has a turn. They build in the notion of silence and thinking time into the meeting. So they feel it feels a bit like a contradiction. But they're very powerful for making sure that people get the same experience regardless of where they actually are. So that's an idea. The other thing, we were talking about, we don't really know what's going to happen with going back into the office. The other thing that I haven't really seen people talking about is the impact of commuting. If we think about the year that everyone's had, the challenges around mental health, the challenges around working hours, volume of work, companies trying to stay in business and people working incredibly hard, incredibly long hours. are we going to just put commuting back into that mix? Or is something automatically going to disappear when we put the commuting back in? I genuinely don't know. But I haven't seen many people talking about that, because average commute is an hour or more, particularly into the cities, maybe 2 hours if you're going in and out of London. What's the impact of commuting going to be on people who are already a little bit kind of stressed out?
Good question.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I feel like everybody I've talked to who's been back in the office has had that moment where they come in for the first time and they're like, I forgot about the trains. There's so many people. Like, what do I do? There's noise everywhere. I mean, and when I was in the US, when I lived outside of Atlanta, my commute started as a 35-minute drive and ended as a 2-hour drive by the time I had only lived out there 2 years, but the congestion just got so bad. So like here, I think, definitely like the trains and sort of the time suck and the whole thing of like, because, we have a 2 hours in and 2 hours out, basically, like maybe a little less. But it's so interesting how much more energy like I have not having to do that commute, and the energy I even had going from the car commute to the train commute. So if you imagine like, the different places where people are doing more of the driving, where they can't like multitask or work on other things, like the mental toll that takes, because you actually have to like focus on the road or you might die, as opposed to a train where, you probably don't have a seat, like, let's be honest. But you can still like listen to a podcast, right? It's an interesting one. I think you're right, though. I think the commuting has really been left out of the conversation about people going back into the office. All I hear is you have to go back into the cities to save Pret. Let's all save Pret. Like, I don't know. I feel like Pret sandwiches I was happy to get rid of that, but that aspect of working in the city. But anyway.
But I think, because the novelty of going back in, I can absolutely see the novelty of going back in. And for some people, it will absolutely be a lifesaver. Those people who are genuinely on their own. And, so let's not overgeneralize, but let's not underestimate the impact that commute might have, unless we can find a way to take something else out or find another way of generating energy. I can't see what it is. I'm really trying to work out, how do we fit a commute into the volume of work that people have got now? I'd love to hear some ideas about what's going to come out for the commute to go back in, because we also started the pandemic going, we'll have 2 hours a day, I can do yoga, I can, and maybe some people have been doing their soda bread and their yoga in those times, but most people have just filled it with work. The day has got longer, hasn't it? So that will be an interesting one, because overwhelm and exhaustion doesn't help your thinking. So the quality of the work is, the quantity is going up, but the quality probably isn't.
Well, on that enthusiastic bombshell, no, I think it's interesting. It's definitely fair. Well, look, it's been a fantastic chat. As you know, and I think everybody else who's in this podcast knows, at the end of every interview, we allow our guests what we call the shill section, which is if there is any way people want to tell people how to get hold of you, or in terms of working with you, or at least connecting with you, or anything you want to talk about, anything you want to shill. Now is your time.
Well, thanks, Rob. I'm an exec coach, and I think the thing to think about with coaching is that I don't think it's the sort of thing you should sell. I think it's the sort of thing people choose to buy. There's no point forcing it on anyone, because it's just not going to be particularly effective unless you come to it willingly. There's something I want help thinking about. So I think it's around, I help people, I provide a time and a space for people to do their very best thinking. So they decide what they want to think about, they decide how they want to think about it, and I will be there for the journey with them. I'll hold them accountable, I'll coax and prod and challenge them to go a little bit further, do a little bit better, and unlock some of the blockages that are in the way to their very best thinking. But some people don't want to do that. Some people want to do it on their own. So it's I wouldn't say it's a selling thing. If you want to get into contact with me, I would love to have a conversation with people, because I love talking to people. I love throwing ideas around, particularly if it's around the notion of thinking, so different ways of thinking, how to improve our thinking. I love just making contact with people, having conversations. So the best way to get in contact with me is just through LinkedIn, Fiona Craig. And if anybody does want to just hit me up, have a cup of coffee and talk thinking, I would love that.
We will make sure that your LinkedIn profile is in the show notes, along with the many varied books that you mentioned. So if anyone want to get in touch with those, they can. Thank you for spending the time to talk to us. It's been a fascinating conversation. So thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Jen, it's been lovely to talk to you.
Well, you did it. You wasted another perfectly good half an hour or so with Rob and Jen and the Everybody Hates Your Brand podcast. Again, you can find us on everybodyhatesyourbrand.com and your podcast platform of choice. And if you happen to be a YouTube user and are interested in behavioral science applied to customer experience and marketing, then please check out my new YouTube channel. It's called Choice Hacking. All you have to do is search Choice Hacking on YouTube. Have a week.
Take great care and be vigilant.